Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carter.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carter. Today is May 11th, 2026, and the title of tonight's show is From PSYOP to Politics, How the Battlefield Moved into the Mind. Now, for centuries, conquest was visible. Armies crossed borders, cities burned, and populations knew when they had been occupied. But over the last 100 years, a different form of conquest emerged. One aimed not at territory, but at perception itself. This investigation traces how psychological warfare gradually escaped the battlefield and entered civilian life through propaganda, public relations, mass media, advertising, behavioral science, social media, and algorithmic technology. Drawing from a century of documented literature and historical analysis, the show examines how modern systems increasingly learned to shape populations, not primarily through force, but through emotion, identity, attention, fear, distraction, and behavioral conditioning. The investigation begins with the early discoveries of crowd psychology and mass persuasion. Thinkers like Gustave Le Bon observed that individuals behave differently once absorbed into emotionally unified crowds, becoming more reactive, suggestible, and vulnerable to repetition and symbolism. Edward Bernays later transformed these insights into modern public relations, openly arguing that public opinion could be engineered scientifically. Walter Lippmann warned that populations do not respond directly to reality itself, but to the images and narratives constructed inside their minds. Long before the internet existed, the foundations for modern perception management were already being built. As the 20th century progressed, warfare itself evolved. Psychological operations, propaganda systems, and informational influence became strategic tools during global conflicts and the Cold War. Yet these methods did not remain confined to military environments. At the same time, television, advertising, and entertainment culture transformed society into a continuous media environment where emotion increasingly empowered contemplation. Neil Postman warned that civilization could lose its ability to think seriously, not because truth was banned, but because entertainment, distraction, and overstimulation made serious thought difficult to sustain. Aldous Huxley, Ray Bradbury, and George Orwell each envisioned different paths toward social control, yet modern civilization now appears to contain elements of all three. The rise of Silicon Valley accelerated this transformation dramatically. Human attention became one of the most valuable economic resources on Earth. Platforms learned how to measure engagement, reinforce emotional reactions, stimulate compulsive behavior, and monetize outrage, identity, fear, and tribal participation. Surveillance capitalism emerged as systems increasingly extracted behavioral data, not merely to predict human actions, but to shape and modify them in real time. The battlefield moved from physical territory into the nervous system itself. Politics became emotional warfare. Algorithms became invisible governors of attention. Entire populations now live inside continuous psychological environments, operating through screens, feeds, notifications, and curated realities. Well, at the center of this investigation is a difficult realization. Modern civilization may not require overt tyranny to manage populations effectively. The systems themselves evolved toward psychological optimization because influence became more efficient than force. The result is a world where attention is harvested, behavior is tracked, emotions are amplified, and reality itself is increasingly filtered through technological systems designed to maximize engagement and control perception. This show is not an argument for a hidden master conspiracy controlling every event. It is an investigation into how technological society, mass media, propaganda science, behavioral psychology, and digital systems converged into a civilization increasingly organized around the management of human consciousness itself. I'm looking forward to tonight's show. It's going to be a long one. Shout out to everybody on the live chat rumble. Number one warrior is Boots, the Sparkman Spleefer, the powder kegger room man himself. Boots says, first 101 degrees day, AC died in Vegas. Ouch. James and Warrior family, glad y'all are here, and let's all help out our host by hitting that thumbs up button. Yeah, if you could all do me a favor, take your thumb, follow me. This is the only way I'm going to get any attraction. If you guys think this show is neat, go down to the X button with me on your phone with your thumb, hit the X, then hit thumbs up, and then hit live chat. You won't lose your spot, I promise. Thank you for the intro. Boots also says, hey, and tell a friend about James's very own award-winning detox formula, ElitePotion.com. Yes, ElitePotion.com. The stuff works, I swear. In fact, we just got 4 orders today. I was really happy about that. So guys, whoever ordered it and you're watching the show, thank you so much. ElitePotion.com. Remove parasites and heavy metals. Just to let you guys know, ElitePotion.com, we're going to be getting an upgrade. We're going to change the look and feel because I don't think that this whole look and feel is doing the job. We're going to get less conspiracy theory on it because apparently people didn't want to buy products from, something like that. So we'll try it out. We'll figure it out. But yeah, new website's coming. So there you have it. All right. Number 2 warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion says, hey, Pastor and Warrior family, it feels great to be back with y'all. That means you guys know me so well. Yes, it does. Scorpion, thank you so much for being here. Number 3 warrior is Robert Gertison saying, hello, everyone. Stoked to be here to learn about the social experiment we are players in. It's up to us to navigate with discernment. I would agree. And let's not freak out about all this shit that I'm talking about. Let's just know that if you're anchored with Jesus Christ and you're following him and you give all of your life to him, you don't have to worry about what the government's doing. All right. But it's good to know. It's good to understand what your enemy is up to so you can help other people get out of it. That's why we expose evil. And number 4 warrior is Surfer Wife. What's going on, Surfer Wife? Haven't seen you in a while. Thank you so much for being here, guys. I love you all. Let's go to a quick commercial, then we'll be right back and start the show.
We are being lied to about our sovereignty, about our health, about birth, and about what's actually best for our families. And most women don't even realize it until they're already in the system. Hi, my name is Lisa, the Sovereign Woman. I'm going live every single day for 31 days at 8 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday on YouTube and TikTok. This is for the woman who knows there has to be another way. A way to give birth without fear, without being controlled, without giving up her authority. Inside these lives, I'm teaching you how to surrender to God, trust your body, and step into a truly sovereign and fearless birth. Not from hype, not from rebellion, but from truth. So if you feel that pull, like something isn't right, like you were made for more than what you've been told, come join me. I'll see you live.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit ElitePotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
I'll give you $10,000 if you can find just one person who's never filed a tax return.
I'll give you $10,000 if you can find just one person who's never filed a tax return.
Have you ever filed a tax return? Yes.
Nobody. Not one. It starts at 16. That first job, that first form. The moment they became a taxpayer. Every April 15th, millions keep signing the same contract, thinking it's the law. But it isn't the law that binds them. It's the signature. 98% of Americans never owed it. Learn more at unincorporatedassociations.com.
All right, we're back, and we're going to be talking about from PSYOP to politics, how the battlefield moved into the mind. Now, welcome to Cause Before Symptom, where we do not chase symptoms. We test the cause against scripture, history, technology, power, and the systems shaping human behavior itself. Well, tonight's investigation begins with that question that sounds almost too large to ask. What if the battlefield has moved? What if modern conquest no longer requires armies crossing borders because perception itself became the territory? What if the most valuable resource in the modern age is not gold, oil, or land, but human attention? Well, for most of history, power was visible. Kingdoms rose through military strength. Empires expanded through force. Citizens knew when they had been conquered because foreign soldiers stood in their streets. But over the last century, another form of power quietly emerged, one capable of shaping populations psychologically before they even realized influence was taking place. The deeper this investigation goes, the harder it becomes to ignore that modern systems increasingly operate through influence rather than force, through emotional shaping rather than visible coercion. And this is not a show about one secret meeting in a dark room. It is an attempt to reduce the world into cartoon villains pulling every string behind the curtain. In fact, the deeper truth may be far more unsettling than just that. What if modern civilization naturally evolved towards systems of psychological management because those systems became economically profitable, politically effective, technologically scalable, and socially stabilizing? Well, what if the structure itself rewards influence over force because influence is cheaper, quieter, and far more sustainable than violence? Well, in the late 19th century, Gustave Le Bon studied crowd psychology and discovered something unsettling. Individuals behave differently once absorbed into emotionally unified crowds. Crowds became more impulsive, more emotional, more reactive, and more vulnerable to repetition and symbols. Well, decades later, Edward Bernays transformed those insights into modern public relations and openly argued that public opinion could be engineered scientifically. Walter Lippmann warned that people do not respond directly to reality itself, but to pictures formed inside their minds through media, narratives, and social framing. Well, long before the internet existed, the foundations for perception management were already being built. Then came world wars. Then came propaganda systems. Then came psychological operations. Then came television. Then came advertising science. Then came 24-hour news cycles. Then came the internet. Then came social media. Then came algorithms capable of learning human behavior faster than human beings understood themselves. The entire environment changed, and with it, the nature of influence itself. So politics stopped behaving like debate and increasingly became emotional tribal warfare. News stopped functioning primarily as information and increasingly became narrative management. Entertainment and outrage merged together into one continuous stream of stimulation. Platforms discovered that fear, anger, identity, conflict, and emotional certainty generate more engagement than calm or reflective ever could, or reflection. Human attention became measurable. Human behavior became predictable. Human reactions became profitable. And what earlier civilizations attempted through censorship and brute force, modern systems increasingly achieve through overload, distraction, emotional conditioning, identity reinforcement, and continuous stimulation. Well, the disturbing part is that almost all of this is openly documented. The books exist. The doctrine papers exist. The business models exist. The algorithms exist. The engagement systems exist. The behavioral studies exist. The attention economy exists. The question is no longer whether propaganda exists. The question is whether modern civilization itself has become as integrated psychological environment operating continuously through screens, symbols, narratives, notifications, entertainment, outrage cycles, and behavioral reinforcement systems. Jacques Ellul warned that technological societies eventually reorganize themselves around efficiency rather than wisdom. Neil Postman warned that civilizations can lose truth not because information disappears, but because people become too distracted to think deeply anymore. Juste Merleau warned about menticide, the gradual destruction of independent thought through war, repetition, confusion, and psychological pressure. Shoshana Zuboff warned that surveillance capitalism transformed human experience itself into extractable data for prediction and behavioral modification. These thinkers came from different backgrounds and times, different political systems, and different eras, yet they all saw the same trajectory emerging. A civilization where human beings are increasingly managed through perception rather than force. A civilization where attention itself is harvested industrially. A civilization where algorithms quietly shape emotional reality. A civilization where politics becomes identity. A civilization where stimulation replaces contemplation. A civilization where convenience slowly replaces discernment. A civilization where people increasingly mistake engineered emotional reactions for independent thought. Doom scrolling. Well, this investigation is not about becoming paranoid. Fear itself becomes another form of psychological captivity. The goal tonight is understanding, because civilizations rarely collapse only around or from external enemies. More often, they decline internally. They lose the ability to distinguish truth from spectacle, wisdom from information, freedom from stimulation, and reality from permanence. They become overwhelmed by noise, addicted to distraction, emotionally fragmented, and psychologically exhausted. Perhaps that is a true danger in the modern age. Not that people are physically chained, but that entire populations may willingly surrender their attention, emotions, identity, and perception to systems specifically designed to shape them continuously. Well, tonight we follow that trail. From crowd psychology to propaganda science, from public relations to psychological warfare, from television culture to social media addiction, from behavioral economics to surveillance capitalism, from military PSYOP doctrine to algorithmic governance. And by the end of this investigation, one thing may become very difficult to ignore. The modern battlefield may no longer be land, sea, or air. It may be the human mind itself. Long before social media, television, or the internet existed, scholars were already beginning to notice something unsettling about human behavior in groups. Individuals who appeared rational, cautious, and thoughtful on their own often behaved entirely different once absorbed into large emotional movements. Crowds did not think like individuals. Crowds reacted. Crowds amplified emotion. Crowds simplified reality. Crowds became vulnerable to symbols, repetition, fear, slogans, and emotional contagion. Well, this realization would become one of the most important discoveries in the history of modern civilization, because once mass psychology becomes understood, it eventually became exploitable. In the late 19th century, French social psychologist Gustave Le Bon published The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. What made Le Bon so important was not merely that he studied mobs or riots. He attempted to understand what happens psychologically when individuals dissolve into collective emotional identity. His conclusion was unsettling. He argued that once individuals became part of a crowd, they often surrender portions of their independent reasoning and begin operating through shared emotional impulses instead. Well, according to Le Bon, crowds are highly suggestible, emotionally reactive, and strongly influenced by repetition, symbols, and authority figures. Well, the crowd does not carefully analyze, the crowd feels. Well, Le Bon wrote that the substitution of the unconscious action of crowds for the conscious activity of individuals is one of the principal characteristics of the present age. That sentence is astonishing because it feels feels less like a description of 19th century Europe and more like a description of modern digital civilization. Social media, outrage cycles, viral movements, online mobs, ideological tribalism, coordinated outrage campaigns, and emotionally charged political movements all operate through many of the same mechanisms Le Bon observed over a century ago. Technology changed the speed and scale, but not necessarily the psychology. Le Bon also recognized something many modern people still struggle to accept. Crowds are rarely moved primarily by logic. They are moved by emotion, imagery, certainty, repetition, and shared identity. Facts alone often fail to compete against emotionally satisfying narratives. Once people became psychologically invested in a movement, evidence itself can become secondary to belonging. Well, this insight would later become foundational not only for propaganda systems, but also for political marketing, advertising, public relations, and mass media itself. What makes this discovery so important is that it shifted power away from merely controlling territory and toward controlling emotional environments. Leaders no longer needed to persuade every individual rationally if they could influence the emotional direction of the crowd itself. Once the crowd moved emotionally, individuals inside it often moved automatically with it. This created a new kind of power structure based not merely on force, but on psychological momentum. Decades later, Eric Hoffer would expand this understanding in The True Believer, his book. Hoffer became obsessed with why people surrender themselves so completely to mass movements. His work examined revolutionary movements, nationalist movements, ideological movements, and religious zealotry. Yet his conclusions reached far beyond politics alone. Hoffer argued that mass movements often attract people searching for relief from uncertainty, insignificance, isolation, or instability. People overwhelmed by confusion or dissatisfaction frequently seek identity inside larger collective causes. Well, this is one of the most dangerous psychological realities in human history because it means movements are not sustained merely by truth or evidence. They are often sustained by emotional need. People do not simply join movements because they are correct. Many join because movements provide certainty, belonging, purpose, identity, direction, and emotional relief from chaos. Once identity becomes attached to a movement, disagreement can begin to feel like personal attack rather than intellectual disagreement. Hoffer observed that mass movements often require enemies to maintain internal unity. Shared outrage creates cohesion. Shared fear creates solidarity. Shared enemies strengthen tribal identity. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history, regardless of ideology. Political systems, religious extremism, nationalism, revolutionary movements, and even modern online communities frequently rely on emotional reinforcement through conflict and opposition. The enemy becomes psychologically necessary because conflict stabilizes the group identity itself. And this is where the investigation begins moving toward the modern age. The discoveries of Le Bon and Hoffer did not remain isolated academic observations. Their insights became absorbed into propaganda systems, advertising science, political strategy, wartime morale operations, and eventually digital media systems. Once institutions learned that human beings could be influenced collectively through emotional shaping, symbolic repetition, and identity reinforcement, an entirely new form of social management became possible. Modern civilization increasingly operates through emotional activated crowds rather than slow, rational discourse. Algorithms amplify outrage because outrage spreads faster than reflection. Social platforms reward emotional certainty because certainty drives engagement. Political systems increasingly operate through identity mobilization rather than careful policy discussion. News cycles reward fear because fear maintains attention. Entire populations now have and move emotionally at speeds no civilization in history has ever experienced before. So the frightening realization is that the modern digital world may represent the ultimate amplification of crowd psychology. Human beings are now connected continuously through global emotional networks operating in real time. Fear spreads instantly. Anger spreads instantly. Identity spreads instantly. Tribal narratives spread instantly. You see, the crowd is no longer limited to physical gatherings in streets or stadiums. The crowd now exists permanently through screens, feeds, hashtags, and algorithmic engagement systems operating 24 hours a day. And yet none of this began with smartphones or artificial intelligence. The foundations were discovered long ago when scholars first realized that human beings inside crowds behave differently than human beings standing alone. That discovery changed politics forever. It changed the media forever. And it changed warfare forever. And eventually, it changed civilization itself. Once scholars discovered that crowds could be influenced psychologically, the next step was inevitable. Someone would attempt to systematize that influence. What began as observation slowly evolved into methodology. The study of mass psychology moved from academic theory into practical application. And during the early 20th century, a new industry quietly emerged around the management of perception itself. Modern civilization would no longer rely solely on controlling laws, armies, or economies. It would increasingly rely on shaping what populations believed, feared, desired, and accepted as reality. One of the most important figures in this transformation was Edward Bernays, often called the father of public relations. Bernays was heavily influenced by the crowd psychology work of Gustave Le Bon and by the psychoanalytic theories of his uncle, Sigmund Freud. What made Bernays different from earlier propagandists was that he openly approached persuasion as a scientific discipline. He believed public opinion could be engineered systematically through emotional association, repetition, authority figures, symbols, and carefully crafted narratives. In his book, Propaganda, Bernays wrote one of the most revealing statements in modern political history. The conscience and intelligence manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. He did not hide the concept. He did not present it as a conspiracy. He presented it as a functional necessity for managing modern mass civilization. Bernays argued that modern society had become too large and complex for populations to independently evaluate every issue rationally. Therefore, specialists in persuasion would increasingly shape public understanding on behalf of institutions, governments, corporations, and political systems. He described this process as an invisible government, not necessarily because it was secret, but because most people were unaware of how profoundly their perceptions could be influenced through media, messaging, and social engineering. One of Bernays' most important insights was that people rarely make decisions based purely on logic. Human beings respond emotionally first and rationalize afterward. It's like when you buy a car, buyer's remorse. This changed everything. Instead of merely presenting information, advertisers and political strategists learned to associate products, ideology, and movements with emotional desires like status, security, identity, belonging, freedom, beauty, patriotism, or fear. Products no longer sold themselves through utility alone. They sold themselves through psychological symbolism. This was the birth of modern perception management. Bernays demonstrated these techniques repeatedly. He helped corporations shape public habits around food, cigarettes, consumer products, and social behavior itself. He understood that if institutions could shape emotional associations, they could shape mass behavior. So the goal was no longer simply to inform populations. The goal was to influence subconscious emotional reactions before rational analysis even began. So around the same time, journalist and political thinker Walter Lippmann was arriving at similar conclusions from another direction. In his book, Public Opinion, Lippmann argued that human beings do not experience reality directly. Instead, people respond or simplified representatives of reality constructed through media, culture, institutions, and social narratives. He called these representations the pictures in our heads. Well, this insight may be one of the most important concepts in understanding the modern world. Most people never personally verify the majority of what they believe about politics, economics, foreign nations, wars, corporations, history, or public events. Instead, populations rely on mediated representations delivered through newspapers, televisions, institutions, influencers, social media feeds, and now algorithms. Human beings increasingly live inside informational environments rather than directly reality itself. Lippmann recognized that modern media systems therefore possessed enormous power. If institutions shape the informational environment, they shape the emotional and psychological framework through which populations interpret reality. While in many cases, controlling perception becomes more important than controlling events themselves. Whoever shapes the narrative often shapes public reaction regardless of objective truth. Well, this realization transformed politics permanently. Governments began investing heavily in propaganda systems during wartime. Corporations invested in public relations, advertising evolved into emotional psychology. Media organizations increasingly recognized their ability not merely to report events, but to shape public interpretation of events. And over time, the management of perception became deeply integrated into democratic societies themselves. Now, the danger here is subtle because democratic propaganda often feels voluntary. Unlike overt authoritarian censorship, modern persuasion systems frequently operate through emotional attraction, repetition, convenience, identity reinforcement, and narrative framing. Populations often believe they are acting independently while their informational environments quietly shape available interpretations, emotional responses, and perceived social consensus. Well, this is where modern media ecosystems become so important. Once populations live primarily through mediated information, whoever controls visibility increasingly controls psychological reality. So certain stories become amplified while others disappear. Certain emotions become rewarded while others become marginalized. Certain identities become socially reinforced while others become isolated. So the public may believe it freely choosing, or believe it is freely choosing, yet the available emotional environment has already been heavily structured beforehand. So the rise of mass media accelerated this process dramatically. Newspapers gave way to radio, radio gave way to television, television merged entertainment with advertising and politics into one continuous emotional environment. Public attention increasingly became concentrated into centralized communication systems capable of shaping millions of minds simultaneously. Entire populations could now experience synchronized emotional reactions to the same narratives, symbols, fears, crisis, and personalities. The 20th century, therefore, witnessed something historically unprecedented: industrial scale perception management. Human psychology itself became an operational domain for governments, corporations, advertisers, and political movements alike. Public opinion was no longer treated as something that emerged naturally from informed citizens. It increasingly became something engineered, measured, studied, influenced, and managed. Can we just go back to camping? And yet most people or never recognize the transition because these systems did not represent or present themselves as coercion. They presented themselves as information, entertainment, patriotism, safety, convenience, consumer choice, and social participation. So the modern age did not simply create new technologies. It created new methods for shaping human consciousness at mass scale. So what began as a study of crowds had now evolved into the engineering of perception itself. As the 20th century moved deeper into global conflict, governments discovered something that would permanently alter civilization. Controlling information and perception could be just as important as controlling territory. The battlefield was no longer limited to tanks, ships, and soldiers. Morale, belief, emotional stability, public confidence, and narrative control became strategic assets. Modern warfare increasingly depended not only on destroying the enemy or an enemy physically, but on influencing how populations interpreted reality itself. During the World Wars, propaganda systems expanded massively. Governments learned how quickly fear, patriotism, outrage, and repetition could mobilize entire populations. Posters, newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, speeches, slogans, and carefully constructed narratives became tools of national survival. Citizens were not simply informed about war, they were psychologically organized around it. The state learned that controlling morale often mattered as much as controlling weapons. So this marked a critical turning point because psychological influence was no longer viewed merely as political persuasion or advertising. It became military doctrine. So by the Cold War era, psychological operations, or PSYOP, had evolved into formal strategic systems. Intelligence agencies, military institutions, and governments increasingly recognized that future conflicts would involve information, perception, ideology, and emotional conditioning, just as much as physical combat. The rise of communism, nuclear fear, espionage culture, and global media accelerated the realization that populations themselves had become strategic terrain. One of the most revealing documents from this era is From PSYOP to Mind War, written by military officer Paul Vallalet and psychological operations specialist Michael Aquino, who was a member of the Temple of Set. He was a Satanist, openly and in the military. The document openly argued that future warfare would increasingly involve psychological dominance over populations rather than merely battlefield victories. The significance of this paper is not internet mythology surrounding it. The significance is that it openly discusses perception itself as a battlefield. The phrase mind war sounds extreme, but the concept behind it reflects a larger historical shift already taken place. Modern conflict was moving beyond conventional propaganda into continuous psychological influence environments. Instead of targeting only enemy soldiers, information systems could influence entire populations emotionally, politically, culturally, and ideologically. The objective was not simply defeating armies. The objective was shaping reality frameworks. Now, this is where many people misunderstand psychological operations. PSYOP is not simply lying to populations. In fact, effective influence systems often rely heavily on partial truths, emotional framing, selective emphasis, repetition, symbolic association, and narrative timing rather than outright fabrication. The goal is not merely to invent reality, but to shape how reality is emotionally interpreted. This becomes especially powerful during periods of fear or instability, like COVID. Fear changes populations psychologically. When human beings feel threatened, uncertain, or overwhelmed, or even emotionally destabilized, they become more dependent on authority, certainty, identity groups, and simplified narratives. Complex realities become compressed into emotionally manageable stories. Nuance weakens, tribalism strengthens, and the desire for stability begins overpowering the desire for careful analysis. So Cold War governments understood this extremely well. Both Western and Soviet systems invested heavily in perception management, ideological messaging, morale campaigns, cultural influence, and information control. Entire populations became psychologically mobilized around competing narratives of freedom, survival, security, and existential threat. The battle was not merely military. It was civilizational and psychological. So at the same time, television was transforming society into a centralized emotional environment. For the first time in human history, entire nations could experience synchronized psychological reactions to the same images, speeches, crises, and narratives simultaneously. So television compressed emotional reality into shared national moments. Politics increasingly became visual theater. War increasingly became mediated spectacle. So this was a very profound transformation because emotional reaction now moved faster than reflective thought. Images bypassed careful analysis. Repetition normalized narratives. Television personalities became trusted psychological authorities inside millions of homes. Public perception could now be influenced continuously at mass scale through emotionally curated informational environments. What earlier empires attempted through direct control, modern media systems increasingly achieved through narrative management. And slowly, the distinction between wartime propaganda and peacetime communication began dissolving. Advertising borrowed from propaganda psychology. Politics borrowed from advertising, news borrowed from entertainment borrowed from emotional manipulation techniques, public relations borrowed from military morale operations. The systems began merging together into one continuous influence environment operating across civilian life itself. And this is one of the most important transitions in the modern age because the technologies developed for wartime psychological influence did not disappear after the war ended. They migrated into civilian systems through marketing, politics, mass media, corporate branding, behavioral research, public relations, and eventually social media architecture. Well, the battlefield came home. And as this transition accelerated, another realization emerged. Populations do not need to be physically controlled if their perceptions can be continuously shaped. If their perceptions, well, they can be. Citizens who emotionally identify with narratives often regulate themselves voluntarily. Entire societies can become psychologically synchronized through fear cycles, outrage cycles, ideological reinforcement, and emotional tribalism without visible coercion ever appearing. And this is why America needed TikTok, because TikTok was not going to be used just to stop us from getting information about Iran or Israel or Ukraine, but actually just to use it for psychological warfare. So this is why modern influence systems often feel invisible. People rarely experience themselves as being manipulated. They don't even know it. They experience themselves as reacting naturally to information environments already carefully constructed all around emotional engagement. So the most effective psychological systems are often the ones populations willingly participate inside. So by the late 20th century, this transformation was already reshaping civilization. Politics increasingly depended on emotional optics. Media increasingly depended on attention capture. Public trust increasingly depended on narrative management. And information itself became strategic terrain. The human nervous system was gradually becoming integrated into the architecture of modern power. And yet the full implications were still ahead, because once computers, algorithms, smartphones, and social media entered the picture, psychological influence would no longer operate only through centralized broadcasts. It would become personalized, measurable, adaptive, and continuous. This is why they're building data centers for control of the people. The battlefield was about to move directly into daily human behavior itself. So if propaganda and psychological operations shaped the 20th century politically, television transformed civilization culturally. The rise of mass entertainment did not simply change how people consumed information. It changed how people thought, how long they could focus, and how they processed reality, and eventually how politics itself operated. For the first time in history, entire populations lived inside a continuous visual stimulation environment where entertainment, advertising, news, identity, and emotional conditioning all merged together. Television. This is where the warnings of Neil Postman became incredibly important. In his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Postman argued that modern civilization was not collapsing primarily because truth had been censored, but because truth itself was being transformed into entertainment. The danger was not simply propaganda. The danger was that serious public discourse was becoming psychologically incompatible with entertainment culture. Postman believed most people misunderstood George Orwell's warning of 1984. Orwell feared societies where information is suppressed through authoritarian force, surveillance, and censorship. But Postman argued Aldous Huxley's Brave New World was becoming the more accurate prediction. Huxley feared a civilization drowning not in silence, but in distraction. A civilization overwhelmed with stimulation, pleasure, noise, entertainment, and emotional gratification until populations gradually lost the ability to think deeply at all. That distinction matters enormously. In Orwell's world, truth is hidden. In Huxley's world, truth became irrelevant. So television accelerated this transformation dramatically because television changed the structure of communication itself. Written culture requires concentration, reflection, patience, and linear thought. Television prioritizes speed, imagery, emotional reaction, spectacle, and fragmentation. Complex issues become compressed into emotionally consumable segments. Politics becomes visual performance, and leaders become entertainers. Thus, public attention becomes shorter, faster, and increasingly dependent on stimulation. This is why people will believe in every conspiracy theory that they find. This is why I used to believe in it, because we were all being manipulated and socially controlled. Postman warned that once television became the dominant culture medium, everything slowly adapted itself to entertainment logic. Religion adapted. News adapted, politics, education, serious discussions became increasingly difficult because the medium itself rewarded emotional immediacy over sustained contemplation. So this shift fundamentally altered political culture. It's where we have right now, Trump and the WWE. Televised politics increasingly rewarded appearance over substance. Emotional performance became more important than policy depth. Sound bites replaced detailed arguments, and public figures became brands. Outrage became engagement, fear became ratings, and the media environment increasingly favored personalities capable of holding attention rather than individuals capable of careful reasoning. This is why I remember when the big fires of LA and all that crap, and Malibu and all that. Remember all the big fires, and the mayor takes off and goes to a summit in South America and told her assistant to handle it. Well, she knows the game, because the more angry they are at her, the more popular she is, the more control she gets. So at the same time, advertising psychology became inseparable from the media itself. Commercial systems learned that emotional stimulation holds attention more effectively than rational explanation. Entire industries evolved around maximizing audience retention through excitement, fear, controversy, desire, and psychological reinforcement. Attention slowly transformed into one of the most valuable commodities in modern civilization. This is where Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 becomes deeply relevant. Bradbury's world is often misunderstood as a simple censorship story, but the deeper warning is psychological. In his dystopia, books disappear because populations no longer possess the patience or desire to engage deeply with them. Society becomes addicted to speed, entertainment, distraction, and emotional comfort. Reflection becomes uncomfortable. Silence becomes intolerable. Thought itself becomes exhausting. Well, Bradbury recognized something that modern technology has amplified dramatically. Distracted populations become easier to manage because constant stimulation weakens contemplation. Human beings overwhelmed by continuous entertainment rarely pause long enough to critically examine the systems shaping them. And then comes Huxley. In Brave New World, his book, maybe one of the most prophetic books in my archives, because Huxley understood that civilizations can become stable through pleasure rather than oppression. In Huxley's world, populations are conditioned from birth into psychological conformity. Entertainment, stimulation, consumption, and emotional gratification replace deeper meaning. People no longer resist the system because the system continuously satisfies their appetites while quietly shaping their consciousness. This is what makes modern technological society so different from older forms of control. Ancient empires often ruled through visible force, while modern systems increasingly rule through emotional dependency. Thus, people become attached to the very systems shaping them because those systems provide stimulation, identity, distraction, convenience, entertainment, and social belonging simultaneously. Well, the result is a civilization where populations voluntarily participate inside environments designed to manage attention continuously. Television laid the foundation for this transformation because it normalized passive consumption. But the internet and smartphones would later intensify it exponentially. Television was still centralized. The audience remained largely passive. Social media changed the relationship entirely because now populations themselves become participants inside the emotional machinery. Well, the distinction is crucial and critical. Television broadcasts emotional environments. Social media personalized them. So algorithms began learning which emotions keep individuals engaged the longest. Fear spreads quickly, anger spreads quickly, identity conflicts spread quickly, outrage spreads quickly, certainty spreads quickly, nuance spreads slowly, reflection spreads slowly, calm spreads slowly. The systems naturally evolve toward emotional amplification because emotional engagement generates attention, and attention generates profit. You understand? This is why modern politics increasingly resemble entertainment rather than governance. The systems reward emotional stimulation over thoughtful analysis. Public discourse becomes fragmented into reaction cycles. Entire populations live inside continuous streams of outrage, spectacle, controversy, and emotional reinforcement. Citizens increasingly consume politics psychologically rather than intellectually. Neil Postman warned that civilizations can lose the ability to distinguish information from entertainment. That warning now feels almost unavoidable. News cycles merge with celebrity culture. Political movements function like fan communities. Algorithms reward emotional intensity over fruitfulness and truthfulness. Public attention fractures into endless streams of stimulation where outrage and entertainment become psychologically interchangeable. The frightening realization is that populations often mistake stimulation for awareness. Constant emotional engagement creates the illusion of participation, while simultaneously exhausting attention spans and weakening long-form reflection. So human beings begin reacting continuously without ever fully stopping to think deeply. And this is why my show will never grow. And perhaps that is the real danger of entertainment civilization. Not merely that people are distracted, but that distraction itself becomes the operating environment through which power functions most effectively. So by the middle of the 20th century, some thinkers began noticing that something deeper, more than propaganda or media manipulation, was actually taking place. The issue was no longer simply that technology provided new tools for influence. The deeper concern was that technological systems themselves were beginning to reorganize civilization from the inside out. Politics, economics, communication, education, labor, entertainment, and even human relationships increasingly adapted themselves to the logic of efficiency, optimization, speed, measurement, and control. Society was no longer merely using technology. Society was becoming technological in its structure and psychology. So few thinkers explored this more deeply than Jacques Ellul. In the Technological Society, his book, Ellul introduced one of the most important concepts in this entire investigation: technique. By the word technique, Ellul did not simply mean machines or inventions. He meant the organized pursuits of the most efficient method possible for achieving any goal. Technique becomes dangerous because once efficiency becomes the highest value, every institution gradually reorganizes itself around optimization rather than wisdom, morality, tradition, or meaning. Ellul warned that technological civilization eventually transforms human beings into components operating inside systems too large and complex for individuals to meaningfully control. Well, what matters increasingly is not whether something is good, true, beautiful, or morally wise, but whether it is efficient, scalable, measurable, profitable, and operationally effective. So the system slowly becomes self-justifying because efficiency itself becomes treated as virtue. So the frightening part of Ellul's analysis is that this process does not necessarily require evil intentions. In fact, he repeatedly argued that technological societies evolve toward these outcomes naturally because systems continuously reward whatever increases efficiency, productivity, predictability, and control. Man, my nose was itching. So this transformation changes everything. Education increasingly becomes workforce optimization. Politics becomes administrative management. Economics becomes data modeling. Human interaction becomes measurable engagement. Relationships become algorithmic compatibility. Citizens become users. Communities become networks. Attention becomes a resource. Identity becomes data. So the language itself changes because civilization begins viewing human beings through the lens of systems management rather than personhood, which really looks like the fallen angels are turning us into a computer. We are the electrons moving through the CPU. Ellul also warned that technique eventually becomes autonomous. In other words, once systems become sufficiently complex, human beings increasingly adapt themselves to the demands of the system rather than the system serving humanity. So technological civilization creates environments where individuals feel compelled to conform because survival, participation, employment, communication, and social integration all depend on compatibility with the system itself. This creates a civilization where efficiency slowly replaces philosophy, procedure replaces wisdom, administration replaces moral reflection, performance replaces truth, and optimization replaces meaning. So Neil Postman later expanded this concern in his book, Technopoly. Postman argued that cultures eventually reach a stage where technology stops functioning merely as a tool and becomes the unquestioned authority organizing society itself. In a technopoly, people no longer ask whether technological systems should dominate life. The system becomes assumed necessities. The systems become assumed necessities. Efficiency and innovation become moral imperatives beyond criticism. So the culture gradually loses its ability to challenge technology because technological progress becomes psychologically fused with the idea of civilization itself. So this creates a civilization psychologically dependent on technological mediation. Human beings increasingly experience reality through devices rather than direct experience. Communication becomes filtered through platforms, relationships mediated through applications, memory externalized into databases. Navigation becomes dependent on algorithms. Information curated through feeds. Emotional life becomes shaped through notifications, matrix, likes, trends, and engagement systems. So the result is subtle but profound. Human beings gradually lose the habit of existing outside technological managed environments. So this matters because technological systems are never neutral. Every system contains assumptions about behavior, priorities, incentives, and values. Platforms shape attention, algorithms shape visibility, matrix shape behavior, and interfaces shape interaction. So recommendation systems shape perception. So once civilization reorganizes itself around digital systems, those systems begin shaping consciousness continuously. Thus, human beings may believe they are freely navigating the environment while the environment itself quietly conditions emotional responses, social expectations, and behavioral patterns. Lewell warned that propaganda itself becomes inseparable from technological society because modern mass systems require psychological integration to remain stable. In earlier civilizations, populations could remain relatively disconnected and independent. Technological civilizations require synchronization. Large tech, large-scale systems dependent on coordination, compliance, participation, and emotional stability. As societies become more interconnected, influence systems become more necessary for maintaining social order. This is one of the reasons modern propaganda often feels invisible. It no longer appears as a wartime posters or government slogans. It operates through entertainment algorithms, social expectations, platform incentives, bureaucratic systems, educational frameworks, media environments, and emotional reinforcement loops. The environment itself conditions behavior long before explicit persuasion begins. Lewell recognized another critical transformation, that technology compresses time psychologically. Human beings increasingly live in environments demanding constant responsiveness. Speed becomes normal. Reflection becomes inefficient. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Patience becomes weakness. Continuous stimulus rewires expectations until individuals struggle to tolerate slowness, contemplation, or uncertainty. Well, this is one of the reasons attention itself is collapsing in modern society. The technological environment continuously fragments concentration into smaller and smaller units. Notification interrupts thought, feeds reward novelty, platforms encourage rapid emotional reaction rather than sustained reflection. Human cognition slowly adapts itself to the rhythm of the machine. And this adaptation is not merely behavioral, it becomes cultural. Entire societies begin prioritizing speed over wisdom, reaction over contemplation, information over understanding, and optimization over meaning. This is why they have to build the smart cities quick, because they have only a window of time before we catch up and figure out what they're going to use technology to enslave us for. Human beings increasingly evaluate themselves according to technological standards of productivity, visibility, engagement, and measurable performance. The value of a person slowly becomes tied to matrix output, responsiveness, and visibility inside the system. The irony is that technological civilization often promises freedom while simultaneously deepening dependence. Devices offer convenience while increasing attachment. Platforms offer connection while shaping interaction. Information becomes limitless while discernment weakens. Well, communication expands while genuine understanding fragments. And the deeper concern is not merely surveillance or censorship. It is that technological society gradually reshapes what human beings consider normal. People adapt psychologically to contain monitoring, constant stimulation, constant engagement, constant emotional activation, constant visibility, and constant optimization. And over time, what once felt intrusive begins feeling necessary. And this is where the modern world begins crossing into something historically unprecedented. Human beings are no longer merely governed politically or economically. They increasingly exist inside fully integrated technological environments capable of shaping behavior continuously through convenience, engagement, emotional reinforcement, and system dependency. Once society reaches that stage, propaganda no longer needs to operate only through explicit messages. The system itself becomes the message. By the early 21st century, technological society crossed another threshold. Human attention itself became one of the most valuable resources on Earth. What oil was to the industrial age, attention became to the digital age. Entire economic systems emerged around capturing, holding, analyzing, and monetizing human focus. Why is it that people keep coming on here and then just shoving stuff? I have to block people just throwing things up. Here, listen to me. And then literally I have to go back to my feed. Unbelievable. Hey, thanks. This is your reality. This changed the structure of power dramatically. Earlier propaganda systems attempted to influence populations broadly through newspapers, radio, and television. Digital systems evolved into something far more sophisticated. Platforms could now observe individual behavior directly. Human beings no longer simply consumed media. They interacted with systems continuously, generating enormous quantities of behavioral data with every movement online. Well, attention became measurable. Emotion became measurable, engagement became measurable, and human behavior itself became economically valuable. Tim Wu explored this transformation deeply in his book, The Attention Merchants. Wu argues that modern media industries evolved into industrial-scale systems for harvesting and reselling human attention. The goal was no longer merely informing audiences or entertaining them. The goal became maximizing engagement because engagement generates revenue. Every additional second of attention could be monetized through advertising, behavioral targeting, and data extraction. Well, this created a profound shift in the incentives shaping modern communication systems. Calm reflection does not generate as much engagement as outrage. Nuance spreads more slowly than emotional certainty. Fear holds attention longer than peace. Conflict drives interaction more effectively than stability. So the system gradually optimized themselves around whatever emotional states kept human beings engaged the longest. And because algorithms learn behavior mathematically rather than morally, they naturally gravitated toward emotional amplification. That's kind of important. Social media platforms discovered that anger spreads rapidly. Identity conflicts spread rapidly. Fear spreads rapidly. Outrage spreads rapidly. Emotional stimulation keeps people scrolling, reacting, commenting, arguing, and returning continuously. Well, the system did not necessarily begin with the intention of the psychologically destabilizing populations, but the incentive structures rewarded whatever maximized engagement, and emotionally activated populations generate enormous amounts of engagement. So this is where Nur Eyal's book, Hooked, becomes deeply important to understand in the modern world. Eyal openly explains how products can be engineered to create compulsive behavioral loops. The process is systematic. Triggers stimulate behavior. Behavior generates rewards. Rewards reinforce habits, and habits create dependency. Well, the framework was designed primarily for product engagement, but its implications extend far beyond applications and software. Modern platforms increasingly operate through psychological conditioning loops. Notifications trigger anticipation. Likes trigger validation. Outrage triggers emotional arousal. Fear triggers vigilance. Social reinforcement triggers belonging. Uncertainty triggers compulsive checking. Algorithms learn which emotional responses keep individuals engaged longest and then continuously optimize around those behaviors. Well, the frightening realization is that many digital systems increasingly understand human behavior weaknesses better than individuals understand themselves. Whew. This is why modern media environments feel addictive. The systems are intentionally designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities tied to reward processing, novelty seeking, social validation, emotional stimulation, and intermittent reinforcement. Human attention becomes trapped inside continuous feedback systems engineered to maximize behavioral repetition. And unlike earlier forms of propaganda, these systems are personalized. Television broadcasts the same message to millions. Algorithms create unique emotional environments for each individual. Feeds adapt continuously to behavior platforms. Platforms learn political preferences, emotional triggers, identity markers, fears, desires, frustrations, and engagement habits. Well, the system evolves dynamically around the user, reinforcing the emotional states most likely to sustain participation. And this is one of the reasons modern populations increasingly live inside separate psychological realities despite occupying the same physical world. Algorithms sort people into informational ecosystems shaped by prior behavior, emotional preference, identity affiliation, and engagement history. Different groups receive different narratives, different emotional reinforcements, different fears, and different perceptions of reality itself. The result is fragmentation of civilizational scale. Fragmentation at civilizational scale. Wow. Shit. Shared reality weakens. Tribal identity strengthens, consensus collapses, emotional polarization intensifies. People no longer merely disagree about solutions. Increasingly, populations disagree about reality itself. Antonio Garcia Martinez explores parts of this transformation in his book, Chaos Monkeys, describing the internal logic of Silicon Valley behavioral systems and advertising architecture. What earlier propagandists could only dream about, digital platforms operationalized mathematically. Human behavior became trackable, segmentable, predictable, and influenceable, and at an unprecedented scale. This created the foundation for surveillance capitalism, where platforms increasingly monetize not merely products or services, but behavioral prediction itself. The implications became enormous. Political campaigns no longer needed only broad demographic targeting. They can micro-target emotional vulnerability individually. Advertisers no longer merely sold products, they shape desire continuously. And platforms no longer merely distribute information, they shape attention architecture itself. Media no longer merely reports events, it competes aggressively for psychological capture. Human beings increasingly exist inside systems optimized not for truth, wisdom, or stability, but for engagement. This is why outrage culture became economically powerful. Emotionally activated populations generate attention, and attention generates profit. Entire industries now depend on maintaining continuous emotional stimulation because emotionally calm populations consume less media, engage less compulsively, and generate less behavioral data. Well, the digital age therefore transformed human psychology into economic infrastructure. Thus, attention became territory, emotion became fuel, behavior became product, identity became leverage, and perhaps most importantly, distraction became permanent. For most of human history, silence and solitude still existed naturally inside ordinary life. Human beings experience periods of reflection whether they wanted to or not. The modern digital environment increasingly eliminates those spaces. Notifications, feeds, alerts, recommendations, entertainment, outrage cycles, and algorithmic stimulation create continuous cognitive occupation. Attention rarely rests long enough for deep contemplation. And this creates populations that are simultaneously hyper-informed and psychologically exhausted. People consume enormous quantities of information while struggling to process meaning coherently. They remain emotionally activated continuously while becoming increasingly unable to sustain focus. They mistake stimulation for awareness, reaction for understanding, and engagement for wisdom. And perhaps that is the deepest transformation of the digital age. The industrialization of attention did not merely change media, it changed human consciousness itself. As digital systems evolved, the internet crossed another threshold. Technology was no longer merely tracking behavior in order to understand consumers. Increasingly, systems began shaping behavior in real time. This marked a profound transition in the history of power because the digital environment moved beyond observation into active behavioral modification. Human beings were no longer simply participating online. They were being continuously measured, predicted, categorized, nudged, reinforced, and psychologically influenced through invisible systems operating at massive scale. Few thinkers explored this transformation more deeply than Shoshana Zuboff in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Zuboff argues that modern technology companies discovered something extraordinarily valuable. Human experience itself could be converted into behavioral data. Every search, click, movement, pause, interaction, emotional reaction, and browsing habit became raw material for predictive systems. Human beings were no longer merely customers. They became data-producing organisms operating inside computational environments designed to extract behavioral information continuously. But Zuboff's warning goes much deeper than privacy concerns. Her central argument is that surveillance capitalism does not simply seek to predict human behavior. It increasingly seeks to shape and modify behavior in ways favorable to commercial, political, and institutional objectives. This is the critical transition. Earlier propaganda systems attempted persuasion. Modern systems increasingly engineer environments where behavior itself can be influenced automatically through algorithms, recommendations, notifications, emotional triggers, and predictive modeling. Well, the implications are enormous because digital platforms now possess something previous empires never had: Real-time behavioral feedback from billions of individuals simultaneously. Earlier propaganda systems operated somewhat blindly. Governments and advertisers could estimate reactions, but they could not observe minute-by-minute psychological responses across entire populations. Well, modern platforms can. Every interaction becomes measurable. Every emotional response becomes data. Every hesitation becomes analyzable. Human behavior itself becomes computational terrain. This creates systems capable of learning populations continuously. Algorithms identify what generates fear, outrage, curiosity, tribal loyalty, compulsive engagement, anxiety, desire, or emotional vulnerability. Well, the systems then adapt themselves dynamically around those responses. Thus, human beings often believe that they are freely navigating digital environments, while those environments quietly reorganize themselves around maximizing behavioral influence. This is where modern technology begins functioning less like passive media and more like behavioral infrastructure. Recommendation systems shape visibility. Search engines shape informational access. Algorithms shape emotional reinforcement. Platforms shape social validation. Notifications shape attention rhythms. Matrix shape self-worth. Feeds shape perception of reality. Human beings increasingly experience the world through systems specifically designed to influence behavior continuously. And one of the most unsettling aspects of surveillance capitalism is that it often operates invisibly. Traditional forms of power announce themselves openly. Citizens knew when laws changed. They knew when armies occupied territory, and they knew when censorship occurred. Modern digital systems influence behavior quietly through convenience, personalization, emotional reinforcement, and predictive optimization. Well, the influence often feels natural because the systems adapt themselves individually to each user. Well, this creates a civilization where manipulation increasingly becomes indistinguishable from participation. And at the same time, Susan Greenfield's Mind Change, her book, introduces another critical dimension to this transformation: neuroplasticity. Greenfield warns that digital environments may not merely influence opinions temporarily, they may physically reshape cognition itself over time. Human brains adapt to environments. If individuals spend years inside fragmented, high-speed, emotionally stimulated digital systems, the brain gradually reorganizes around those patterns. Ouch. This is one reason modern attention spans appear increasingly fractured. The digital environment rewards rapid switching, constant novelty, emotional stimulation, and continuous responsiveness. Reflection weakens, deep concentration weakens, patience weakens. Human cognition slowly adapts itself to fragmented informational rhythms. Well, the environment does not merely change behavior externally, it begins changing mental habits internally. Greenfield's warning becomes especially important when combined with algorithmic systems. If digital environments reshape cognition while algorithms simultaneously optimize emotional engagement, then technological systems are no longer simply influencing thought. They are shaping the cognitive conditions under which thought itself occurs. And this creates historically unprecedented forms of power. Political systems can now micro-target psychological vulnerabilities. Corporations can influence purchasing behavior continuously. Platforms can reinforce emotional states algorithmically. Institutions can monitor population reactions in real time. Governments can observe social patterns instantly, and behavior itself becomes governable through computational systems. So the frightening realization is that these systems rarely require covert coercion. Human beings willingly participate because the systems provide convenience, entertainment, social connection, identity reinforcement, stimulation, and emotional satisfaction simultaneously. Well, the digital environment feels useful while quietly reorganizing behavior underneath the surface. This is one of the reasons modern control systems often appear softer than historical authoritarianism. Instead of forcing obedience visibly, systems increasingly shape probabilities invisibly. Algorithms do not always command behavior directly. They influence tendencies, they amplify certain reactions, they reward certain patterns, and they suppress visibility selectively. They shape emotional environments gradually until populations begin adapting automatically. So the line between persuasion and programming becomes increasingly blurred. And this transformation also changes the meaning of identity itself. In earlier civilizations, identity emerged primarily through family, geography, religion, local culture, and direct human relationships. In the digital age, identity increasingly becomes mediated through platforms, matrix behavior profiles, algorithmic categories, online communities, and curated representations of self. Human beings increasingly encounter themselves through data systems. This creates enormous psychological vulnerability because platforms capable of shaping identity also possess the power to shape belonging, self-worth, fear, aspiration, outrage, and emotional attachment. Entire populations increasingly build emotional lives inside systems optimized not for human flourishing, but for behavioral extraction and engagement maximization. So Zuboff warns that surveillance capitalism represents an overthrow of the people's sovereignty. That phrase is critical because the issue is no longer merely technological innovation. The issue is whether human autonomy itself can survive inside environments designed to predict and shape behavior continuously. So perhaps this is the greatest psychological shift of the digital age. Earlier civilizations struggled against visible rulers, armies, and institutions, while modern civilization increasingly struggles against invisible architectures of influence embedded into the environment itself. Thus, power becomes environmental rather than merely political. So the systems no longer simply tell populations what to think, they shape the conditions under which thinking occurs. So as technological systems became more immersive and psychological influence became more sophisticated, another question emerged beneath the surface of modern civilization. What happens to human beings living under continuous emotional pressure, information overload, fear cycles, social fragmentation, and psychological stimulation? Well, at what point does exhaustion itself become a form of control? Well, the modern world increasingly places individuals inside environments of permanent cognitive tension where outrage, uncertainty, fear, distraction, and emotional activation rarely stop long enough for genuine reflection to recover. This is where Juste Merleau's book, The Rape of the Mind, becomes extraordinarily important. Merleau was not merely studying propaganda in the traditional sense. He was examining how psychological pressure gradually weakens independent thought itself. He introduces the concept of menticide, the killing of the mind through fear, confusion, exhaustion, repetition, and coercive psychological environments. Merleau recognized something modern digital society appears to be intensifying dramatically. Human beings under continuous stress become easier to manage psychologically. Fear destabilizes cognition, confusion weakens certainty, overstimulation fragments concentration, and emotional exhaustion reduces resistance. Populations overwhelmed by constant crisis often begin seeking relief through authority, conformity, tribal identity, or simplified narratives. Well, this process rarely feels dramatic while it is happening, and that is what makes it dangerous. Psychological surrender usually occurs gradually. Individuals adapt incrementally to environments that would once have felt intolerable. Constant surveillance becomes normalized, constant outrage becomes normal, continuous notification becomes normal, emotional volatility becomes normal, and algorithmic dependency becomes normal. Thus, human beings slowly acclimate to permanent psychological occupation. Merleau warned that language itself can become destabilized inside manipulative systems. He describes semantic fog, environments where words lose stable meaning through repetition, propaganda, emotional framing, and contradictory narratives. This becomes extremely important in the digital age because modern populations increasingly live inside informational environments where narratives change rapidly, emotional framing overrides precision, and language itself becomes tribalized. Words that once carried stable definitions become emotionally weaponized. Conversations become difficult because populations increasingly operate from entirely different informational realities. People stop debating facts and begin defending identity structures, and emotional reaction overtakes careful interpretation. The result is psychological fragmentation of civilizational scale. This fragmentation creates populations that are simultaneously hyperconnected and deeply isolated. Human beings consume enormous quantities of information while struggling to form coherent understanding. While the nervous system remains continuously activated, yet genuine clarity becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Individuals often feel exhausted, anxious, overstimulated, distracted, and emotionally depleted without fully understanding why. Maybe after they listen to one of my podcasts. One reason this matters is because exhausted populations often prioritize relief over truth. Human beings under continuous psychological pressure become more vulnerable to simplistic solutions, emotional certainty, ideological tribes, and systems promising stability. Fear narrows cognitive bandwidth. Chronic uncertainty weakens independent analysis. And over time, emotional fatigue itself becomes politically and psychologically significant. This is where Andrew Lobachowski's ponerology enters the conversation. Labachowski's explored how psychologically unhealthy systems can gradually normalize manipulative, exploitative, and emotionally destabilizing behavior while presenting themselves as rational or necessary. His work focuses heavily on pathological influence inside institutions, but the broader insight becomes highly relevant to modern society. Systems themselves can become psychologically disordered while still appearing functionally externally. Well, this is important because modern civilization increasingly rewards emotional manipulation economically, politically, and technologically. Outrage generates engagement, fear generates attention, identity conflicts generate participation, emotional stimulation generates profit, and the systems therefore amplify psychological volatility because volatility sustains interaction. Stability and contemplation are less economically productive than continuous activation. As a result, entire populations now exist inside permanent emotional weather systems. Crisis cycles never fully end. News feeds continuously reinforce urgency. Algorithms continuously stimulate reaction. Social media continuously pressures identity performance. Individuals increasingly feel compelled to remain psychologically connected to every crisis, outrage event, controversy, and emotional trend occurring across the world simultaneously. So the human nervous system was never designed for this level of continuous stimulation. For most of history, human beings experience stress locally and intermittently. Modern digital civilization globalizes emotional pressure permanently. Fear no longer arrives occasionally, it arrives continuously through screens. Conflict no longer feels distant, it becomes psychologically immersive. Human beings increasingly carry the emotional weight of the entire information environment every single day. Well, this creates conditions where discernment becomes difficult. Exhausted people struggle to think deeply. Emotionally overloaded people struggle to separate signal from noise. Constant stimulation weakens contemplation. Continuous reaction weakens wisdom. Populations become vulnerable not necessarily because they are unintelligent, but because their cognitive and emotional resources remain perpetually occupied. Perhaps this is one of the most important realizations in the entire investigation. Psychological surrender does not always happen through visible oppression. Sometimes populations surrender gradually because exhaustion itself becomes unbearable. Human beings overwhelmed by complexity often seek emotional simplicity. Individuals flooded with uncertainty often cling to tribal certainty. People drowning in noise often surrender discernment in exchange for belonging, security, identity, or relief. And this may explain why modern civilizations increasingly feel emotionally unstable despite possessing far more information than any society in history. And the issue is no longer access to information now. The issue is psychological capacity. Human beings are now attempting to process civilizational scale emotional environments continuously while algorithmic systems compete aggressively for attention, outrage, fear, and engagement. Well, the result is a civilization where the human mind itself becomes exhausted terrain. Not conquered physically, conquered psychologically through endless stimulation, emotional overload, fragmentation, fear, distraction, and the slow erosion of inner stillness itself. Remember, the Bible says, "Be still and know that I am the Lord." One of the greatest mistakes modern societies make is assuming civilizations collapse suddenly. History rarely works that way. Most civilizations decline internally long before collapse becomes visible externally. The process is usually gradual, psychological, cultural, moral, and spiritual before it becomes political or economic. Institutions continue functioning, markets continue operating, technology continues advancing, entertainment continues distracting. Yet underneath the surface, something essential begins weakening inside the civilization itself. This is where thinkers like Oswald Spengler and John Bagot Glubb became incredibly important because both men studied long-term civilizational patterns and concluded that empires often follow recurring cycles regardless of geography, race, religion, or political ideology. Their work matters because they were not merely describing economic decline or military overextension. They were describing psychological and cultural exhaustion. In The Decline of the West, Spengler's book argued that civilizations behave almost like living organisms. They experience periods of birth, expansion, creativity, ambition, consolidation, intellectualism, mechanization, and eventual decline. One of Spengler's most unsettling observations was that advanced civilizations often become increasingly dominated by money, administration, technology, and mass systems during their later stages. Cultural vitality slowly gives way to technical management. In the early stages of civilization, societies tend to reorganize around meaning, belief, sacrifice, vision, and long-term purpose. But as civilizations become wealthier and more technologically advanced, they often drift toward comfort, materialism, entertainment, abstraction, and bureaucratic control. Well, the civilization gradually loses the inner psychological cohesion that originally gave it strength. Spengler warned that late-stage civilizations increasingly prioritize systems over meaning. Mass media expands, financial concentration intensifies, politics becomes theatrical, populations become psychologically fragmented, cultural confidence weakens, intellectual life becomes detached from ordinary reality. Well, citizens increasingly seek stimulation instead of purpose. The civilization continues functioning materially while declining internally. This is one reason modern societies can appear technologically powerful while simultaneously feeling emotionally unstable. Material advancement and psychological health are not the same thing. In many cases, technological abundance actually accelerates fragmentation because populations become increasingly disconnected from the disciplines and shared values that originally sustained the civilization. John Bagot Clubb reached similar conclusions in his book, The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival. Clubb examined numerous empires across history and noticed reoccurring phases appearing repeatedly. According to Clubb, civilizations often move through periods of expansion, commerce, affluence, intellectualization, decadence, fragmentation, and eventual decline. Well, what makes his work powerful is how psychologically recognizable many of these phases feel today. Clubb argued that prosperous civilizations frequently become increasingly obsessed with entertainment, luxury, celebrity culture, identity conflict, political division, and personal gratification during later stages. Wealth creates comfort, Comfort weakens resilience, and weakened resilience produces populations less capable of sacrifice, discipline, and long-term thinking. The civilization slowly loses the psychological strength that originally built it. And this is where the modern technological society becomes especially vulnerable. Advanced civilizations possess enormous technological power while simultaneously experiencing growing psychological instability. Information expands while wisdom weakens. Connectivity expands while loneliness intensifies. Entertainment expands while meaning erodes. Consumption expands while spiritual exhaustion deepens. Citizens become surrounded by stimulation, yet increasingly disconnected from coherence, purpose, and inner stability. One reason this matters is because psychologically fragmented civilizations become easier to manage through systems rather than shared values. As trust declines, institutions increasingly rely on surveillance, administration, algorithms, bureaucracy, behavioral management, and technological coordination to maintain stability. Human relationships weaken while systems dependency strengthens. This creates a civilization increasingly reorganized around management rather than meaning. So the population becomes emotionally reactive but spiritually exhausted. People remain politically engaged while becoming psychologically fragmented. They become hyperconnected yet socially isolated. They become overstimulated yet internally empty. As this fragmentation intensifies, public discourse deteriorates into tribal identity conflict rather than genuine collective problem solving. Citizens no longer perceive one another primarily as neighbors participating in a shared civilization. Increasingly, they perceive one another as competing ideological tribes existing inside separate realities. Well, this is one of the most modern politics feels permanently unstable. The issue is no longer merely disagreement over policy. The issue is fragmentation of shared perception itself. Populations increasingly lack common narratives, common trust structures, common moral frameworks, and common informational realities. Emotional polarization intensifies because identity itself becomes psychologically fused with politics. At the same time, technological systems amplify the instability continuously. Algorithms reward outrage. Media rewards fear. Platforms reward emotional activation. Economic systems reward attention extraction. The civilization slowly becomes trapped inside permanent stimulation loops where emotional volatility itself becomes economically profitable. This creates conditions where populations increasingly lose the ability to distinguish seriousness from spectacle. Politics becomes entertainment, crisis becomes content, leaders become brands, public discourse becomes performance. Well, citizens remain emotionally activated continuously while becoming psychologically exhausted simultaneously. So what's really happening is this is a big powder keg ready to blow up. Spengler believes civilizations often decline that not because they lack intelligence, but because they lose inner coherence. The society becomes materially advanced, but spiritually fragmented. Technique expands while meaning collapses. Administration grows while wisdom weakens. The civilization becomes highly efficient externally while increasingly unstable internally. Perhaps this is what makes the modern age historically unique. Previous civilizations declined slowly over generations. Modern technological civilizations accelerated psychological fragmentation at speeds no earlier empire ever experienced. Social media compresses emotional contagion into real time. Global information systems amplify instability continuously. Attention economies reward division structurally, and human beings now experience civilizational stress psychologically every hour of every day. So the result is a civilization drifted towards psychological exhaustion at mass scale. People feel overwhelmed, distrustful, fragmented, emotionally reactive, continuously stimulated, unable to focus deeply, unable to disengage, and unable to rest mentally. Maybe this is why we have school shootings. Yet they remain connected continuously to systems demanding more attention, more reaction, more outrage, more participation, and more emotional energy. Perhaps this is why modern civilization increasingly feels unstable despite unprecedented technological advancement. Well, the issue is no longer whether the system functions mechanically. The system functions extraordinarily well mechanically. The deeper question is whether human beings themselves can remain psychologically healthy inside environments optimized for stimulation, management, behavioral extraction, and continuous emotional activation. Thus, civilizations rarely collapse all at once. More often, they slowly lose the ability to hold themselves together internally. And once that happens, the external collapse eventually follows. This is the left hating the right hating the left. He's calling them the crazies and the Trumpers. Well, we've lost our minds. I have 2 more chapters to go. And if you guys want to read the rest of this, you got to go to my website. But yeah, that's it for me. Too much information. Perhaps Duran Duran was right. All right, guys, that's it for me. God bless you. God keep you. God thank you. Tune in maybe tomorrow if I did not go gold mining. It might be with Urban. I don't know. But this has been Cause Before Symptom, where we don't chase symptoms. We test the cause against Scripture. God bless you. God keep you. And we'll see you guys mañana.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.